Individual political policies refer to the dictum known as legal and illegal, in reference to the status of certain activities, whether such activities are permitted or prohibited by either a state or decentralized community, whether in hierarchy or anarchy. For instance, it is an individual political policy that marijuana is legal in certain countries, and as well illegal in others. It is an individual political policy that divorce on demand is permitted, while it's prohibited in different areas of the world. When discussing the subject of paternalism, whether or not it's moral and just to prevent others from harming themselves in the name of their own interests, even with this going against their freedom, there is a legal and ethical distinction which is very, very rarely made. And that's a shame, considering that such a distinction, a dichotomy in this case, is absolutely necessary in order to steer and implement political policies. For people like myself who are individualists and anarchists and are, as an organic result, ideologically in opposition to paternalistic policies, it is necessary to recognize that freedom should be expanded as far as possible, but not at the expense of it hurting people who haven't consented, which leads us to discuss the dichotomy of social acts versus private acts. People will ask anarchists, so if you're against authority and want to abolish rules, does it mean you'll make murder legal? What about rape? Other forms of sexual violence? Will you permit anything, no matter how evil it is? In response, anyone who is logically opposed to paternalism doesn't believe that victimless crimes should be seen as the name implies, crimes, will hopefully make the distinction between private acts versus social acts. However, the issue is that they usually don't. More often than not, anti-paternalists and general anti-authoritarians will respond by stating that they don't see certain actions, including even that of group activities, as harmful, as opposed to, more reasonably, remarking that it doesn't matter whether or not an act itself, in itself, is harmful exclusively by itself, but whether or not it's a private or social act. If someone is truly in favor of freedom, including freedom which permits harm and misfortune to be brought to the person enacting such liberty, they have to legalize all private acts, but refuse to do the same for social acts. A social act and a private act are actually extremely easy to define and are not difficult concepts to comprehend. Quite simply, as it's all there is to it, a private act refers to an activity or phenomenon that involves only one person, while in contrast, a social act refers to an activity or phenomenon that involves two or more people. Masturbation, when it involves only one person touching their genitalia, is an example of a private act, while sexual intercourse, which always involves two or more people definitionally, is an example of a social act. If someone is, unconditionally, in favor of freedom, they'll be of the belief that all solo masturbation should be illegal, since the only harm caused by it exists in the world of the person who executed it, while certain types of sexual intercourse or all sexual intercourse should be illegal. If one person is involved in activity, not featuring anyone else, there can be no violation of liberty, but rather the prohibition of such a private act exists as a violation of the individual's liberty and individualism. If one person is involved in something sexual, there can be no rape, no sexual abuse of any variety. If two people are involved, however, that is when rape and all matters of sexual abuse often occur. When this is put into perspective, it can help provide understanding as to why certain people, not limited to but primarily featuring radical feminists, think the way they do and believe what they believe. Additionally, it can now hopefully be understood that an individual's opposition to, seemingly only at face value, harmless and victimless acts, which are inherently social, such as marriage, BDSM, and medical transitioning, are actually indeed harmful in creating victimization. When debates surrounding the legality of marriage occur, oftentimes the question of whether same-sex marriage should be legal arise, with both the supporters and opponents of this individual political policy failing to see that this is, as all marriage is, a social and not a private performance, and by extension legally binded contract. An extremely problematic argument, or non-argument if you will, in favor of legalizing same-sex marriage is, in paraphrased terms, that it is a private act, and that it shouldn't involve anyone except the two or more people who become married or who want to marry each other. This, of course, appears to be normalizing and rationalizing abuse, including but not limited to sexual abuse, economic abuse, and domestic violence of all sorts. Of course people should be concerned with social acts such as marriage, as it definitionally has to be between two or more individuals, causing a variety of controversies and conflicts between spouses. To say, it doesn't involve you, so it's none of your business. It's like saying that someone shouldn't oppose child sex slavery in Iridia because they're not a sex slave themselves, one of the trade's rape victims. This is an absurd and cruel way of thinking, and none of it is backed by any degree of reason. It is ignoring argumentation from one's ideological opposition in favor of personal attacks, what does and doesn't directly affect a rightfully concerned individual. Anarchism is against rulers, but not rules. However, it would be pretty foolish to be against any private acts, let alone plenty of private acts, as governments are today and have been since their violent establishment, since that would clearly violate the liberty of individuals, tearing them apart from their rights granted by natural law. Yet, it is also absurd to not be critical of social acts, since they are often violent, often non-consensual, unlike private acts, actually able to be non-consensual, and create an immense quantity of distress, misery, and horror in a society, or in the lives of isolated individuals who live outside of the urban realm. I'm in favor of banning guns. I'm in favor of abolishing marriage, both of the opposite sex and same-sex variants. I'm in favor of prohibiting trans-identified individuals from accessing hormone products or getting sex reassignment surgery. I'm here to state that none of these policies I support are, to any degree, authoritarian or paternalistic, as they are neither, and cannot ever be. When someone owns firearms, even though they can own such guns by themselves and not use them against anyone else, so it can be a private act, it oftentimes is a social act, as people quite clearly want to use such firearms, want to exercise that of the bullet. It leads to violence between civilians and increased rates of homicide and bullet-caused injuries. Marriage is always a social act, so that requires no explanation. And medically transitioning is a social act, not only because trans-identified individuals want to be perceived differently by society, and not just themselves, but because of cultural pressures placed upon trans-identified people, which, through bad recommendations, compels them to worsen their own lives and, by extension, worsen the lives of those around them, including their sexual and romantic partners who are often sexually victimized by deception by such transsexually modified individuals. People who are actually authoritarians and paternalistic in attitude like to, and successfully tend to, dishonestly manipulate language in order for it to appeal more to their own agendas. For instance, one can phrase natalism as a right, that one should be able to rule over their children because it is freedom to do so, and to dare take away this supposed right of theirs would be a violation of their liberty. Likewise, capitalists often say that work is seizing the means of production from the bourgeois class is authoritarian and against freedom, as the capitalists are no longer legally able to continue exploiting, stealing from, and dictating the lives of their workers. You might notice the way such social practices, which are anything except victimless, are being phrased is in favor of such authority existing, in favor of rulers ruling. It is for this reason that the private act versus social act dichotomy is so important and correct. It is scenario after scenario in this cultural climate, of abusers defending their abuse by claiming that putting a halt to their abuse is itself a form of abuse. An extraordinarily important distinction that arises from understanding social versus private acts is that of solo sexual acts performed by a child versus group sexual acts involving a child, as in someone under the age of 18. A child cannot consent to sexual activity with another person, regardless of that person's age. Children cannot consent to sexual stuff with other children, nor with adults. However, they can consent to sexual stuff by themselves as long as it exists only insofar as they exclusively do stuff with themselves. A child masturbating another child is rape, the rape of both children. A child stimulating their own genitalia, however, is consensual. It is generally understood that an adult child showing an underage person pornography, exposing it to them, especially if they're really young, is a form of sexual abuse, due to uneven power dynamics. And the fact that the underage person has been influenced by another constitutes sexual abuse. Or at least I thought it was, but I don't have any grasp on what people believe, both nowadays and in the past, as so many people are outwardly proud to support and promote sexual abuse. Misery, that's not only where we're depressingly at, but have been for, well, forever. On the other hand, if a child discovers pornography on their own, not having been shown any of it by anyone else, it is generally understood that it is not sexual abuse, and that the child has consented to such exposure. It doesn't really matter what people believe anyway, as truth still persists regardless of their various inappropriate, creepy beliefs. You can say it's not good that a child has exposed themselves to pornography, but you can't say the child didn't consent to it, since it's entirely a private action. It is of the utmost importance people are critical of many social acts and oppose their existence on legal grounds, for much criminalization should occur. Prostitution, sexual intercourse, gambling, firearm ownership, transsexualism, marriage, capitalist business, and parental authority. None of these things are private, but are always or almost always social, and it is because of this that their legal status should rightfully be debated. I'm of the belief that they should be banned because they're the center of victimization and abuse, and are anything except individualistic. If you are against paternalistic policies, you can't debate whether or not drugs, smoking, solo masturbation, viewing and owning uncensored versions of media, freedom of speech that doesn't prompt actions which could cause harm to others, learning instruments, religious fanatics, am I right? Voluntarily becoming obese, refusing to exercise, drawing hentai or comic erotica, wearing whatever clothes you want, being a nudist in one's own privacy, and committing suicide, among many other private acts, should be legal or illegal. Absolutely, they should be fully legal, without exception. They are all private acts, involving only one person. I'm also of the belief that any social act which involves the enthusiastic consent of all on board should be illegal. However, I recognize that just because consent can occur, the absence of consent is not absent in different cases, and thus I advocate for the banning of all guns. If someone's against criminalizing anything, regardless of how social that thing is, which permits for harm to be non-consensually transmitted, they're not anarchistic, but actually the authoritarian one. I, alternatively, understand that in order to have freedom, that means no one's freedom is allowed to arrive at the expense of anyone else's. It is why this dichotomy is so important.